On the 20th of March 1995, the Tokyo subway sarin attack became one of the most terrifying terrorist attacks in modern history. Members of a Japanese Doomsday cult released sarin nerve agent across 5 separate subway lines during the peak of the morning rush hour. 13 people died. Thousands were injured. The images that emerged from those underground stations that morning shocked the world, but here is what the world did not know. 2 years before that attack, on the other side of the world, deep in the Western Australian outback, that same cult had already been testing their weapons on Australian soil, and what they may have detonated in the Australian desert in 1993 was something far more terrifying than sarin. To understand what happened at Banjawan Station, you first need to understand the organisation behind it. Aum Shinrikyo, which translates roughly as Supreme Truth, was founded in Japan in 1984 by a partially blind, self-proclaimed prophet named Shoko Asahara. He claimed to be the reincarnation of both Jesus Christ and the Buddha. He claimed to have the ability to levitate. He claimed that the end of the world was imminent and that only his followers would survive it. What made Aum Shinrikyo uniquely dangerous among Doomsday cults was the caliber of its membership. Asahara actively recruited from Japan's most elite universities physicists, chemists, biologists, engineers. By the early 1990s, the cult had amassed an estimated $1 billion in assets and had cells operating across Japan, Russia, and, as Australian authorities would later discover, deep in the Western Australian outback. The cult was not merely preparing for the apocalypse, it was preparing to cause one. In September of 1993, a group of Aum Shinrikyo members arrived in Australia. They were well dressed, they were polite, and they were carrying enough money to purchase a sheep station the size of a small European country. Banjawan Station sits approximately 900 kilometres northeast of Perth, in the Gibson Desert region of Western Australia. It covers approximately 200,000 hectares of flat, featureless, extraordinarily remote land. The nearest town is hours away. There are no neighbours. There is almost no reason for anyone to go there, which was, of course, precisely the point. The cult paid approximately 400,000 Australian dollars for the property. They told local real estate agents they intended to mine for gold. Nobody questioned them. Nobody had any reason to. Within weeks of taking possession, specialised equipment began arriving at the station. Scientists followed, and sheep, a small flock of sheep, were brought onto the property for reasons that would only become clear much later. Australian authorities would later determine that Aum Shinrikyo used Banjawan Station to test a homemade version of sarin nerve agent. Sarin is one of the most acutely toxic substances ever synthesized. A single drop on exposed skin is potentially fatal. It attacks the nervous system within seconds. It has been classified as a weapon of mass destruction by the United Nations since 1993. The same year Aum Shinrikyo was producing it in the Western Australian desert. The sheep were the test subjects. 29 sheep died at Banjawan Station during the cult's occupation. The deaths were noted by a local contractor who visited the property. But in the remoteness of the Western Australian outback, dead sheep are not unusual. No investigation was launched. Nobody connected the deaths to anything sinister. The cult was satisfying themselves that their formula worked, that the nerve agent they had synthesized was potent enough, that when they deployed it in a confined, crowded space, it would do exactly what they needed it to do. 18 months later, they deployed it on the Tokyo subway. But the sarin testing was not the most alarming thing that happened at Banjawan Station. On the 28th of May, 1993, several weeks after the cult took possession of the property, something extraordinary occurred in the Western Australian outback. At approximately 11 o'clock at night, a massive explosion lit up the desert sky. Witnesses across a vast area reported seeing a blinding flash of orange and yellow light on the horizon. The ground shook. Windows rattled in buildings hundreds of kilometres away. A truck driver on a remote outback road reported that his vehicle was lifted and shaken by a shockwave. Several witnesses described seeing a mushroom-shaped cloud rising above the tree line. The event was recorded by geological monitoring equipment across Australia and as far away as international seismic monitoring stations. The readings were consistent with a significant explosion, but inconsistent with any known natural geological event in the region. Australian authorities investigated briefly and concluded the most likely explanation was a meteorite impact. No meteorite was ever found. No crater consistent with an impact was ever located. The investigation was closed. It was not until 2 years later, after the Tokyo subway attack, that a United States Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations began looking at what Aum Shinrikyo had actually been doing in Western Australia. What they found alarmed them enough to include it in a formal Senate report. The United States Senate investigation confirmed that Aum Shinrikyo had not come to Western Australia merely to test nerve agents. They had come to mine uranium. The geological surveys the cult had conducted at Banjawan Station revealed uranium deposits on the property. The cult had the scientific personnel, physicists and chemists among their membership, with the theoretical knowledge to attempt crude nuclear weapon construction. They had the money to acquire equipment. They had the motive. Asahara had spoken openly within the cult about acquiring nuclear capability. And they had a remote location where nobody was watching. The Senate report stopped short of concluding definitively that the 1993 explosion was a nuclear test, but it raised the question, formally and on the record, which, in the measured language of a United States Senate investigation, is itself extraordinary. Independent researchers have noted that the seismic signature of the Banjawan explosion, its magnitude, its depth reading, its wave pattern, shares characteristics with very low-yield nuclear detonations. Not a sophisticated weapon, but potentially a proof of concept. A test to determine whether a crude device would detonate at all. If that assessment is correct, even partially, then a Doomsday cult successfully detonated a nuclear device in the Australian outback in 1993, and the Australian government closed the investigation without ever knowing. Aum Shinrikyo left Banjawan Station in late 1993. They returned to Japan. And on the 20th of March 1995, using the same nerve agent they had tested on Australian sheep in the Western Australian desert, they attacked the Tokyo subway. In the weeks that followed the Tokyo attack, Japanese police raided cult facilities across the country. Shoko Asahara was arrested, hiding in a sealed room inside a cult building. He was ultimately convicted of murder and executed in 2018. Australian authorities launched a belated investigation into what had occurred at Banjawan Station. The property was searched. Evidence of the sarin experiments was confirmed. The uranium prospecting was confirmed. The timeline of events was established. But the explosion of May 1993, the most alarming event of all, was never conclusively explained. No official Australian investigation has ever formally ruled out the possibility that what detonated in the Western Australian desert that night was a nuclear device. They have simply never answered the question. There is a version of history in which Aum Shinrikyo successfully detonated a nuclear device in Australia in 1993, in which a Doomsday cult operating freely on Australian soil, tested a weapon of mass destruction in the desert, while the rest of the country went about its day entirely unaware. We do not know with certainty that this is what happened, but we also do not know that it is not. What we know with absolute certainty is this: a cult that would go on to commit one of the worst terrorist attacks of the 20th century operated freely in remote Australia for months. They synthesized nerve agents. They mined for uranium. Something exploded with enough force to shake the earth across hundreds of kilometres of desert, and no government, Australian or Japanese, has ever fully accounted for what happened there. Australia came closer to a weapons of mass destruction attack on its own soil than most Australians will ever know. The Outback kept the secret, and to this day, nobody has gone back to find the answers. If this story disturbed you as much as it disturbs me, please subscribe to Great Australian Mysteries. Australia's history is darker and stranger than most people realise, and we are only just getting started. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the explosion was a nuclear test? I want to know what you think.